Okay, of course, we're not here to debate the existence of Moses, historicity of Moses, or any of those other characters. So that would be a completely different debate. We're only here to debate the historicity of Jesus, and it's interesting that he presented all of this evidence for Moses and Daniel and all these other people that we actually don't have for Jesus. That's quite interesting. Also, the evidence he talked about for Joan of Arc. We don't have any of that kind of evidence for Jesus either. What I also found interesting, though, is that on the Moses thing, he's choosing to go against the mainstream scholarship and choosing an isolated, what most people would call a fringe scholar, as his authority instead. So I want it to be established now that they can't use the argument against me now that I'm going against the consensus or that I'm a fringe scholar, since they're completely comfortable going against the consensus on that issue. So they're fine with saying that the consensus view that Moses didn't exist is wrong and that they can pick and choose which scholar they're going to follow. So let's do that. And in this case, let's just follow where the evidence leads rather than citing consensus arbitrarily. Now, I write in Proving History why we can't trust the consensus in Jesus studies, because it's based on methodologies that every single expert who's written a study of these methodologies has concluded are logically invalid or inapplicable in the case of the historicity of Jesus. And I cite all of these scholars and all the scholarship on that in Proving History. I won't belabor it here. Obviously, in this particular format, we have a limited amount of time, so I have to be very selective as to which things I'm going to talk about. To go further in depth on all of these things, to really explore this issue, you've got to look at my literature, you've got to look at their literature. This debate isn't going to answer all questions. So let's go straight to the evidence for Jesus. The evidence begins with the oldest documents we have, or the oldest texts that we have, which are the authentic epistles of Paul. There's 7 of them. The mainstream consensus on this is that there are only 7 authentic ones, and the later ones are forgeries. We can talk about that later if it comes up. But if we look at the authentic ones, the 7 that are believed by most scholars to be authentic, these epistles don't have any clear references to Jesus ever being on earth. They never mention Jesus having a ministry. They never mention Jesus being a miracle worker or an exorcist or a healer. They never mention disciples. They never mention there being disciples. They never mention Jesus hand-picking disciples. So that's what we're looking at in the epistles. And to give you examples of what they do talk about, we look at Romans 16. What Paul says is that all they know about Jesus, all the gospel, comes from revelation and from scriptures. No reference to human tradition, no reference to hand-picked disciples, no reference to coming from Jesus directly as a preacher in Galilee, for example. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives us a summary of the gospel in which the only sources he cites for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is scripture, and the first time he mentions in this list of events that anyone ever saw Jesus is after his death. In other words, when he appeared as a revelation to the first apostles. That's the first time he says anyone ever saw them, or saw him. And we see this in Galatians when Paul talks about what this experience is like, and he says very emphatically, it is not an experience of a normal human man, it is an experience of a revelation of Christ. So he's talking about revelations, what we would call visions, whether they were pretended or actual hallucinations, or whether he's referring to dreams, because in antiquity, dreams and hallucinations were not distinguished. Dreams and visions were often not distinguished. In Philippians 2, which we have another account of what Paul believed, and a lot of scholars believe that this account actually predates Paul because of certain stylistic elements, he talks about Jesus being a pre-existent being who descends, becomes incarnate, dies, and is resurrected. Again, no reference to miracle working, no reference to having a ministry, no reference to choosing disciples. Even in 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul quotes Jesus on the institution of the Eucharist ritual, he says he received it directly from the Lord, in other words, by revelation. And that's all we get in the epistles. We get no other concrete evidence of anything going on earth particularly. Then we get to the Gospels, which come what was then a whole lifetime later. Average human lifespan, or life expectancy for an adult back then was 48. The Gospels start to be written roughly 40 to 50 years after Jesus would supposedly have lived, and that's with the Gospel of Mark. These are written by unknown authors, by the way, and have highly mythical content. They have things like Jesus withering fig trees. We have hordes of resurrected undead coming up out of the tombs and visiting Jerusalem. Lots of stories that in any other book we would not believe them. But we have Gospels like this for other non-existent people, like Romulus, Hercules, Aesop. We have examples of this. So we're stuck wondering, well, are these like the Gospels of Romulus, Aesop, and Hercules, or are these like legendary stories told of Alexander the Great or other historical persons? We can't tell just by saying they exist. You have to actually examine them in detail. And maybe we can get into that later in this debate, but we just can't tell just by looking at them as they are. So what we end up with is that the Gospels have all kinds of material and new claims that we don't see in the epistles, where we would expect them to be. The epistles seem to be unaware of this stuff. Then we get to the extra-biblical evidence after the Gospels. Now this stuff starts to appear about 60 years after Jesus would have lived. And none of these examples that we might come to later in this debate, none of them can be established as independent of the Gospels or Christians quoting the Gospels. There's not a single one of them can we show that they had a source other than Christians quoting the Gospels or the Gospels directly. So those can't be used as evidence because they're not independent corroboration. So all we have are the Gospels, which all seem to be based on one Gospel, which is Mark, which comes a lifetime after these events supposedly occurred and decades after Paul wrote the epistles. Now that's it, actually. There's no eyewitness accounts, there's no there's no hostile eyewitness accounts, there's no artifacts, nothing like that. And even in terms of impact, Jesus' impact on history is no different than the impact of the angel Gabriel in the creation of Islam, for example. So you don't have to be a historical person to have impact in that sense. But we have clues to what was going on. You have to remember that the sect that survived to decide which texts would survive the Middle Ages and in what condition they would survive the Middle Ages was the one sect that believed in historical Jesus or pushed the historical Jesus as part of their creed. But we have clues to others. We have Irenaeus, who refers to certain sects that were going around at the time claiming that the birth and other aspects of Jesus' life occurred in the heavens, and they were claiming that the Gospels were, or that the Gospel stories were allegories for this heavenly thing. We have this even in the New Testament in 2 Peter, where the common view of most scholars is that 2 Peter is a forgery because it was written in a different authorial style than 1 Peter. So it clearly wasn't written by the same author, but it refers to 1 Peter. So this is why scholars generally agree 2 Peter could not have been written by the same author as 1 Peter and therefore could not have been written by Peter. And it says, it actually refers to these other Christians, we know nothing else about but this, that they were claiming the Gospels were cleverly devised myths, and the author of 2 Peter tries to rebut this by claiming, no, we were eyewitnesses of Jesus, and he invents an eyewitness account of meeting Jesus. Which means he's trying to counteract Christians, actual Christians, who were teaching that this physical interaction, this actual meeting of Jesus didn't occur, that the gospel stories were actually allegories for higher truths. We have another example of the ascension of Isaiah, which is in the earliest reconstructible redaction of this. Scholars can date it somewhere between the 80s and 130s AD, basically the same time that the Gospels were being written, or the canonical Gospels were being written. And in this, when we look at this earliest reconstructed redaction, when we look at all of the different manuscripts, it exists in several languages, and we can see that Christians tried editing and altering it in different traditions. But when we eliminate those alterations, and we look at, for example, the version that we see in Latin or in Slavonic, we find that the actual text, as it has, does not have Jesus visit Earth. It actually says that he is executed by Satan and his demons in the lower heavens. So we actually have this gospel text that's actually written by some early Christian sect that we otherwise know nothing about, that taught that the drama, the passion of the Christ, is something that occurred in the lower heavens and not on Earth. And we have an analogy for this in Osiris. In Osiris cult of the same time, there were public stories which had him as a historical pharaoh at a particular historical time who was later deified. But these same people who were spreading those stories had their special stories for themselves that said that those stories were allegories for the real truth, which was the cosmic truth, which has Osiris descending, becoming incarnate, dying, and then resurrecting in the lower heavens. So we had examples of this type of thinking where you have a double truth. You have the historical fictions, which are allegorical, and then you have the cosmic idea of a cosmic death and resurrection. So we have those analogies. So the usual challenges to what I'm proposing start, for example, with trying to extract history from the Gospels, but as I mentioned, the experts who've examined the methodologies for this have concluded they don't work. But one of the most common examples is to try and point to embarrassing stories in the Gospels, that no one would make up an embarrassing story. We actually know that's false. For example, the worshippers of Attis made up the story that Attis castrated himself, and that was actually one of the most embarrassing things that you could claim about your leader or deity. And yet they made it up and spread this story anyway. You wouldn't argue that there actually was a god Attis and he actually did castrate himself because no one would make this up. No, people make up embarrassing things all of the time. Oftentimes they do this as a shibboleth. In other words, a way to weed out insiders from outsiders. If it's a difficult thing to believe, then you have to commit to the faith. So you can't have free riders. So this idea of having something that's embarrassing is actually usually a cornerstone of many religions in terms of this, in order to ensure that anyone who does move in to believe this thing is committed to the faith. And also as a countercultural message. But at the same time, the things that are often claimed to be embarrassing in the Gospels aren't really very much. And we might get to some examples of that. I'll talk about John the Baptist as the most typical one that they cite. Usually it's said that they would never make up the idea that John the Baptist would, that Jesus would subordinate himself to John the Baptist. But in fact, the story told in Mark does not have him do that. It actually has the opposite. It has John the Baptist, the leader of the leading Baptist cult of the time, endorsing Jesus as his successor and superior explicitly. That's not embarrassing. That's exactly the kind of story you want to make up. And not only does he do that, but then the ceremony that ensues is an exact model for Christian baptism. And that's the actual point of it in the story, that Jesus is undergoing this baptismal ritual as a model for other Christians. What does he do? He's cleansed of sin and he's adopted by God. And that's exactly what all of what the whole idea of Christian baptism was about. It was only later that this allegorical story started to create embarrassment for certain Christians who were uncomfortable with the implications of it. Mark shows no embarrassment by the story at all. So there's no reason to think that embarrassment could explain that. It's an obvious kind of fiction that someone would make up for their particular religion. So that gets us to the other type of argument that's usually argued, which is that there are references in the epistles of Paul that could imply a historical Jesus. Usually they'll say like the reference to a crucifixion and burial, but I've already mentioned that you can have deaths and burials and so forth in the lower heavens. Paul never clearly places them on earth. He never says the Romans did it. He never says Pontius Pilate did it. He's very vague about that. So we can't come to any conclusions as to where Paul was imagining this crucifixion and burial. And in the opening of my colleague here, or my opponent, he mentioned the revelation of Moses. It's interesting that he missed the part where in the revelation of Moses it says explicitly that Garden of Eden, the paradise, was in the third heaven. And this is actually what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12. So Paul is actually an adherent of the exact same teaching that paradise, the Garden of Eden, is located in the third heaven, which means that connects him to this document and its tradition. So when the revelation of Moses says that Adam was buried in paradise, it actually says he's brought up, raised up into the third heaven and buried there. So you can have burials in heaven, even in Jewish tradition. Usually then they'll cite, Paul often refers to teachings of Jesus. Paul doesn't exactly call them that, but he calls them commands of the Lord and such things. But we already know where Paul's getting these things. He tells us. He says he's getting them from Revelation, revelations of the Christ. Even in 2 Corinthians 12, he even relays a whole two-way conversation he's having with an outer space Jesus. This is not a conversation he's having with a historical Jesus walking around Galilee. This is a revelatory Jesus that he's getting sayings and teachings from. So we can't get anywhere with that. So then usually it will be noted that Paul twice references brothers of the Lord. And obviously if Jesus is the Lord and Jesus had brothers, he must have existed. But the problem with this is that Paul shows no knowledge of there being biological brothers of the Lord. The only brothers of the Lord he seems to be aware of are baptized Christians. And he says Jesus is the firstborn among many brethren. And in fact, baptism for Paul, as he says many times, what happens when you get baptized is that you are literally adopted by God and therefore become a son of God. And therefore you are the brother of all other sons of God, including the Son of God. So all Christians would have been brothers of the Lord. And Paul never makes a clear distinction, so we can't make anything out of that as to which thing he's talking about when he references brothers of the Lord. So then they'll reference a passage where it says that Jesus was born of the seed of David. Now, actually, the word is not the word that Paul usually uses for human birth. He uses a different Greek word. The Greek word he uses in this passage is the same word he uses for God's manufacture of Adam and for God's manufacture of our resurrection bodies. So it looks like what we're looking at is divine manufacture. And this disturbed Christians who later tried to change the one word to the other because they were also bothered by this. And the same thing we get with the born of a woman, which they'll often cite. That whole argument is about being born of the same, all of us being born of the same woman, which is an allegory, Paul says, for the natural world of flesh, as opposed to the celestial world, the celestial city. So when he's talking about that, once again, he uses the exact same word for manufacture. So he's not really talking about birth, if we follow Paul's own use of language. And he's actually explicitly saying that the entire argument he's making in that section, which is Galatians 4, is a whole discussion of allegorical motherhood and allegorical citizenship that he goes through, and he says we are born basically of the same woman that he's talking about. Everything else you look at will go the same way. And obviously, I've only touched on the tip of the iceberg. There's many other arguments we can give. There can be back and forth on all of the things that I've mentioned. But when we look at all of this, the evidence for Jesus being historical is very weak, and the evidence for him originating as a revelatory being is as strong as we can expect, given the state of the evidence. Thank you.
Now we will have Mark Smith. Mr. Timer, his time will be 4 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Good to see everybody here. I'm going to do what I label a if, blah, then blip type argument. If Bible Jesus had actually existed, the Jesus of the New Testament, if he existed, was very well known. He had face-to-face meetings with King Herod, Pontius Pilate, and the high priest. That would be the equivalent of meeting with President Obama, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Pope. Add to that the 800 men of the Roman cohort who were sent to arrest him, witnessing firsthand an amputee being healed. Several years later, the Apostle Paul told King Agrippa that these things of Jesus had not been done out of sight in some backwoods corner. And according to the Apostle John, the deeds of Jesus were so numerous, the world itself could not contain the records thereof. In short, everyone who was anyone knew who Jesus was and what he was capable of doing. Given all of this, the Romans would have conscripted Jesus to instantly heal wounded soldiers, reanimate soldiers killed in battle, eliminate logistical problems in feeding armies on the march, transport armies over unbridged rivers, wither away enemy forces via a fig tree curse, command demons to attack, and predict enemy troop movements. In light of these superhuman powers, does it really seem plausible that the following conversation between Pilate and his chief of staff would have gone down like this? So I'm seeing Jesus today, the Jesus who can walk on water, heal the sick, and raise the dead? The Jesus who could make me, Pilate, the next emperor of Rome, and the wealthiest man on earth? That Jesus? Well, I really don't see any use for him. Let's go ahead and kill him. Does anyone really think the Romans were so stupid and blind as to not see what Jesus could have done for them? The Romans may have been a lot of things, but one thing they weren't is militarily stupid. They conquered most of the known world and held on to it far longer than any country before or since. The fact is, if Bible Jesus had actually existed, he would have been the proverbial goose that laid golden eggs, the most valuable man on the face of the planet. Whoever controlled him would have controlled the world, become rich beyond belief, even immortal. Jesus would have been the ticket for Pilate to become emperor, or the means for the Jews to finally throw off the Roman occupation. Somebody, somewhere, would have found a use for him, just like we and the Soviets did with Werner von Braun and his V-2 rocket engineers. But there are no signs whatsoever of this ever happening. If you've been told a hurricane is going on right outside your door, yet when you look out the window, all the signs of a hurricane are lacking, you know that you've been lied to. Likewise, when some dubious documents claim the biggest hurricane in human history took place around 30 AD, yet there is not one sign of a branch or leaf swaying in the wind, you know for a fact, without even opening that door, that you have been lied to. We can't open the door of history, but we can see the total and complete lack of signs in history. If Bible Jesus had actually existed, then the Romans or the Jews or somebody would have used him, and the world today would be a much different place. But it's not. Nobody ever used him because he never existed. And Christians can yell hurricane all they want, but without the leaves blowing and the trees swaying, there is no hurricane, just a lot of hot air. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now we will move into a 30-minute period of informal discussion where the Christianity side, as well as the atheism side, will have a chance to, let's just say, discuss each other's points. So we'll open it up with Christianity side. Mr. Timer, please set our time for 30 minutes countdown, beginning now. Thank you.
Might need to hold the microphone a little closer to the...
Hang on. Can we just pull it out of here? Maybe not. There we are.
Right. To say that there's no eyewitness accounts when people say that there are eyewitness accounts, it seems rather ad hoc that you're just deciding that,
Where are we talking about?
Well, we have a number of references. You have 1 John says that we saw him, we heard him, we touched him. Of course, we have the reference there in Peter that we were eyewitnesses to that. So we have a number of places that talk about there actually being.
So you're just talking about the letters, the epistles, 1 John and 2 Peter.
Sure.
Yeah, but we know 2 Peter is a forgery.
How do we know that again?
Because it's written in a different stylistic. The Greek style of it is very different from the style of 1 Peter, and it references 1 Peter. Therefore, it had to have been written after 1 Peter by someone who didn't write 1 Peter.
Because it references 1 Peter, it came after 1 Peter.
Yes.
Okay, I think I agree with that. 2 Peter came after 1 Peter?
Yes, but the point is, it's clearly written by a different author. So,
have you written a letter to different people?
Yeah.
Do you use a different style, maybe to your wife?
Not in this sense, no. We're talking about actual proper stylistic analysis, average sentence length, vocabulary, things like that.
Okay.
This is well established in the field. I mean, you can read
Sure.
Bart Ehrman's book, Forged, has a good summary of the scholarship on this.
I'm well aware of that. I question their conclusions because I don't think that they're being very objective. So, if you had two letters in front of you and you say, well, this one is clearly not the same person, even though they're both in Greek, they're both...
we do this in courts all the time. Stylometrics is a whole forensic field. It's been used many times in courts of law to establish that a forgery has been made of a letter, for example, and using the same language. You can have two letters in English. You can use stylometrics to prove that a different author wrote each one. It's the exact same methodology. And I think the reason you can't accept the mainstream consensus on this is because you have fundamentalist Christian beliefs, and therefore you're actually prevented from accepting that conclusion. So you have to believe that 2 Peter is an authentic doctrine, whereas I don't have to believe either.
Right. But of course, on the other hand, you would hold to the atheistic doctrine, right? That there is no God, and so therefore something that says it's an eyewitness account.
Well, that has nothing to do with it. I mean, I can fully accept that there was a historical Jesus. I mean, it's completely, there's two different things as to whether we're talking about Jesus was the Son of God or supernatural being, or whether he existed.
The question of his divinity is beside the point.
Oh, I agree, but that's the point, is my being an atheist doesn't prevent me from believing that Jesus existed. In fact, for most of my atheist life, I was convinced that there was at least some sort of historical person that started it all. It's only actually in the last 10 years, when I started examining the evidence, that I realized that it didn't hold up. But it's perfectly acceptable, and there are many atheists who have no problem accepting that there's a historical Jesus. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
2 Peter 3:4 says, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation." Whoever wrote 2 Peter, the earlier Christians have already died off. if Peter wrote it, Peter was dead when he wrote it. That would be a true miracle. Whoever wrote Peter is saying that that generation is already dead, gone, and buried.
What makes you think the fathers are talking about Christians?
It's obvious, and he's talking about the second coming.
Well, he's not talking about.
Where is the promise of his coming, i.e. Jesus?
Right. Okay.
Since the fathers have passed away.
He goes back to creation.
It would be impossible for the Apostle Peter to have written this
But the
book.
fathers weren't Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're always considered the fathers. I mean, you have Pirkei Avot.
But they weren't the people who saw the first coming of Jesus, though.
Right, but they're talking about the fathers. These guys are Jewish, by the way.
Well, why would it matter whether...
I mean,
none of those guys met Jesus, so why would their having died have anything to do with when Jesus would return?
But he's writing to Jews. Okay.
Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. He's talking about the expectation that Jesus should have appeared a second time by now, but the people who said that have all died.
No, he's like, okay, so where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. So things have been going on.
But we're talking about the second coming of Christ, right? Not the first coming of Christ.
Yes, I fully understand that.
Yeah, so why would it be relevant that...
Because the point is that life has been going on ever since the beginning.
Yeah, but that argument doesn't make any sense in context. So your interpretation doesn't make any sense of his argument. I mean, he's trying to explain, he's saying that that the originators of the religion, the first people to see Jesus, have all died off, therefore we're expecting Jesus to have come by now. He's trying to answer that argument.
Well,
why would it matter that Abraham and stuff died hundreds of years before Jesus' first coming? That wouldn't have anything to do with when his second coming.
Because the point here is that ever since the creation, since the time the fathers fell asleep, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, things have been going on.
You're basically pulling at straws. The obvious interpretation here is that it's talking about the second coming of Jesus, and there's people mocking the Christians, saying, where is the sign of his coming? And everything's continuing as it always has, the world going on as normal, and the fathers have died off. It's obvious from the context in the verse itself, the fathers is referring to the apostles, to the early Christians, to the Apostle Paul, etc., the bigwigs of the church. This was written at a time when those people were history. They've already passed. That's obvious to anybody that reads the verse.
Well, I guess it wasn't obvious to me. I'm sorry.
Actually, I can grant your interpretation as a possible reading of that verse, but it does change the argument that's being made in the passage, if that's the case. And it would even then suggest that the author of this doesn't even believe in a first coming of Jesus, because even the overthrow of the demons that's supposed to have occurred with Jesus' arrival, he's essentially denying this. Nothing has changed.
No, I mean the coming that is now in view is, of course, his second coming. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense at that point to say, well, he's coming the first time when he's already come. They're clearly looking forward to the second. I mean, the first time he came, they're like, well, this is kind of a surprise. We didn't expect you.
And you're agreeing then that Jesus changed nothing about the world in the first coming?
No, I didn't say that.
That's what he's saying. That's what 2 Peter is saying.
Doug, in your presentation, you mentioned that people that wrote the Bible have been discovered in archaeology. We're not concerned so much with the Old Testament people here. The debate was on the existence of the Jesus of the New Testament. Could you please cite some of the archaeological evidence that, say, the Apostle Paul ever existed? Thank you.
Do you have archaeological evidence that your great-grandfather existed?
I have photographs.
Yeah, actually.
Your great-grandfather? Awesome.
Birth certificates are archaeological evidence.
Okay.
So.
Well, okay, but
let's grant. I mean, the point of your argument is that there's going to be lots of people who historically existed for whom we're not going to have archaeological evidence.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. And we do have testimonies,
Yeah, but yes, I mean, we could pick a better example than our grandfathers, but I can grant the whole point that we can find people like that. So the question then becomes, do we have reason to doubt their historicity? And like I went through the whole sequence of evidence, I think we do in the case of Jesus. But we don't have that same kind of reasons to doubt, for example, I would say the existence of Paul, for instance. I think we can credit the existence of Paul. We don't have the kind of evidence we would need to actually doubt that, whereas we do for Jesus. The sequence of evidence is bizarre otherwise, and we have precedents for it.
Yeah, and I understand that you do not accept many of these, or maybe any of these resources or these sources, but, we do have Cornelius. We have, of course, Pliny the Younger.
Oh, you mean Tacitus?
Yeah, excuse me,
Yes.
Cornelius Tacitus, excuse me. Tacitus. So there is definitely reference being made to Jesus. Now, keep in mind, the Romans did not consider the Jews to be human. They were subhuman. Okay, so...
That's actually not true.
Well, it is true, actually.
Well, no. I mean, the Emperor Titus even married a Jewess. So, I mean,
Well,
she was a Roman citizen.
Becoming a Roman, yes.
Josephus was a Roman citizen.
Yes,
he was actually
once,
elevated.
Yes,
by,
once exactly. They're elevated. Once you become a Roman citizen, then you now are part of the human race. But otherwise, you're considered dogs.
That isn't the way they categorize things. No, not at all. I mean, there may have been Romans who thought that. I'm not aware of any evidence of them thinking they were subhuman.
I tend to agree with the historian on this one.
Yeah, no, there were tons of people who, I mean, the whole view of the Romans, the Roman view of the Jews was that they had a silly religion. They didn't regard them as not human. Quite to the contrary, they were willing to give them citizenship. They were willing to marry them. They're even willing to join their religion. There are a lot of Romans and Gentiles, Greeks and so forth, who converted to Judaism. In fact, a lot of Jews weren't racially Jews. They were converts to Judaism because Exodus provides for this. And this was fully accepted. I mean, the only problems the Romans had with the Jews was their religion, not their species.
So, Doug, the archaeological evidence for the Apostle Paul?
I'm not aware of any archaeological evidence for the Apostle Paul.
You more or less claimed there was some.
No, that was not my claim. My claim was
okay.
that people who are mentioned in the Bible, such as Caiaphas. Right.
Caiaphas is an example, yeah. Oftentimes we have fictional stories that have historical characters inserted in them.
Lincoln, Vampire Hunter? A lot of history in there.
But yes, so the idea that there were satellite characters inserted into the story doesn't establish that all the characters in the story are actual existing persons. So we can't really get anywhere with that kind of argument. I'd also like to go back to, you'd mentioned Tacitus and Pliny. Pliny actually doesn't reference a historical Jesus. He just says that these Christians worshipped a Christ figure. He doesn't say anything about his historical existence one way or the other. But Tacitus, if the passage is authentic, I don't even think it is, but let's grant that it is for the sake of the debate, all he does is repeat what Christians were preaching in the early 2nd century. This is really very late. So you can't use him as a corroboration of the Gospels because he doesn't say he checked these facts. He doesn't say he double-checked that the Gospels were correct or even mentions what his source is. So we can't establish it as independent of the Gospels. Therefore, it's not usable as evidence.
Well, I would disagree with that. It's unlikely that a good historian, which you can appreciate, a good historian is going to check his sources. He's not going to just listen to rumors.
Yeah, they do that all the time.
Would you do that?
Well, no, I belong to a modern tradition of historical methodology. In fact, the methodology tradition that I'm a part of is only as recent as the 1950s. Actually, before the 1950s, methodology was worse,
right.
And that's modern methodology, whereas in antiquity, their methodology was much worse than
70 times Tacitus distinguishes between confirmed and hearsay accounts.
Yeah, but notice he doesn't do that here.
Well, okay.
I mean, so he actually, when he actually went through the bother of checking something, that's when he mentions it.
Okay.
Right.
So
when he doesn't mention it, he's often just repeating things that people told him. And in fact, we know one of his sources was Pliny. In fact, so he often corresponded with Pliny and got information. He asked Pliny for information to include in his histories. And we know when Pliny first encountered Christians, he had no idea what they believed and interrogated them. Didn't double check their claims at all. So we actually have an account of someone not double checking their claims. And Tacitus and Pliny were best buds, and they were actually governing adjacent provinces at the time this happened. So, in fact, the most likely source of Tacitus is his buddy Pliny, who just told him what these silly Christians were saying. And Tacitus would have found it so embarrassing that he wouldn't need to fact check it. He says, "This is ridiculous. I'm going to run with this story."
Okay.
Just like TMZ or what is the
the and of course, I mean, but Tacitus or Pliny, excuse me, got some of his information by torturing certain deaconesses. And so, their story held, as it were.
But the only story he says held was that they worship a Christ.
Right, but
But even if...
I mean, when he was examining them, to examine means that they were, like, being brutally tortured, okay? So...
Well, not necessarily brutally. I mean, torture can mean all kinds of different things. So we're not actually sure
so
in what way he strong-armed them.
Painful, but not super painful, I guess, right? I mean,
but it's irrelevant because these are people in the early 2nd century. They would have these women would have no way of double-checking what the claims they were told. And we have tons of people in religious cults who believe things that are false, but they fanatically believe them anyway. So we couldn't really use that as evidence because these aren't eyewitnesses. These aren't women who would have access to any kind of corroboration of just what they were taught, which would be just what the Gospels were preaching.
Something else I'd like to point out about history. When Christians talk about history backing up their religion, they're not just intellectually curious about it as an armchair discussion in the living room. You as a Christian are willing to bet your life that there's enough evidence to prove Jesus existed and what he said was true, etc., etc. It's not just an idle curiosity. You are actually betting your life on earth, and if there's life afterwards, that one too, that all of this is true. That's a lot more. I would not bet my life on my great-great-grandfather existing, who he was, the details of his life, etc., etc. And there's probably a lot better evidence for him than there is for a Jesus. The fact that you would make such an awesome investment in time, effort, etc., and be willing to die for it on such minimal evidence, if there even is any evidence, I think is not a wise choice in one's life.
Well, it also illustrates what we're talking about. These women would be in the same position, right? They would have no better access to the evidence necessarily than you do now, but yet they would fanatically believe it, and they would, repeat it the same way Muslims would, the same way Buddhists would, the same way even Mormons would. There are probably plenty of Mormons who would endure torture and death, insisting that the golden plates existed, even though it's pretty doubtful that they did. So that doesn't really prove anything. But anyway, Pliny doesn't actually reference any historical Jesus. He just says they worship a Christ. But if he did get this Christ story from them, they would have gotten it from the Gospels, because that's all the information that we see in the story that's in Tacitus, if even that is authentic. But I'd like to bring up, you'd mentioned, I wasn't going to mention it because I thought it was too much detail to include in such a short debate, but you mentioned Philo. In actual fact, he says that the figure in Zechariah 6 is an archangel, in particular, an archangel who is the firstborn son of God, God's high priest, celestial high priest, not the earthly high priest, the image of God, and God's agent of creation. And these are all attributes that we find Paul and the book of Hebrews assigning to Jesus, and it just so happens that the figure in Zechariah 6 that he's referring to is named Jesus in Zechariah 6. So we're looking at an amazing improbability here. We have someone writing before Christianity originated. He's already acknowledging that there is an archangel who has all of these peculiar attributes that was recognized in the Jewish angelology. And then we have Paul coming along. He didn't necessarily read Philo, because this is probably just an angelology that's known widely. But Paul comes along and is talking about the exact same Jesus, who's the agent of creation, the firstborn son of God, God's celestial high priest, which we have in the book of Hebrews, and the image of God. He's talking about the same kind of Jesus. That's really unlikely coincidence, unless they're actually talking about the same angelology figure, the same figure from Jewish angelology. Now, they're probably writing independently of each other, referring to a common angelology tradition within Judaism at the time. And the reason we can come to this conclusion is because it would be an enormously improbable coincidence otherwise. So that's the basis for that.
Yeah, and I understand that. I love Philo, and I think Philo has some tremendous insights. And it's almost like he is, his discussion of the Logos is something that, I as a Christian be like, it rings nicely in my ears, okay? That the word Yehoshua, or Yeshua at that case, I did not see it in the text, so I'm not sure where you got that. That was not in the actual text.
He's saying that the figure in Zechariah 6 is this figure.
Yes.
The figure in Zechariah 6 happens to be named Jesus. I mean, he would know that. He was an expert on the scriptures. So,
yes, indeed.
Yeah, he doesn't have to actually, fill out the whole scriptures for you. It's not
I mean, the thing is, of course, as you know, there was this huge messianic expectation, right? Ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, there had been this growing anticipation that somebody, the seed of the woman, and then it comes to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., until it goes through David, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we know that there were many sects of Judaism that were very much expecting some kind of a Messiah figure, right? And so
yeah, but Philo's not talking about a messianic figure. He's talking about a pre-existent celestial being, an angel, an archangel, he says specifically. The idea of using this archangel as the Christ, as the Messiah, that seems to be the Christian innovation.
Well, I disagree with that. If you go back to the Targumim, you will find the Memra And the memra is what we translate into Greek as the logos. And that is, it's the same idea. So he was this intermediary being between, let's call him God the Father or God Almighty.
Oh, certainly an intermediary being.
So there
it's not
was
the same thing as the Messiah, though.
Well, I understand your nuance, but you know, they all.
I'm just trying to figure out what your argument is. I don't quite.
Well, I'm responding to the idea that Philo was. That there was this great expectation of the Messiah back then.
So maybe it's just a misunderstanding of the evidence, what the relevance of Philo's passage is. What Philo establishes is that there was already an archangel named Jesus who has all the attributes that the Christians are. So they're talking about the same archangel, and this is before Christianity. So you don't actually need a historical Jesus to explain where they're getting the idea of this particular being. And Paul specifically says that his Jesus is a pre-existent being. He's the agent of creation. He existed before.
Yes, and of course the Hebrew Scriptures talk about that. They're talking about
the same figure. And what happens is the Christians appear to have taken this angel from Jewish angelology and then created a story of him descending, becoming incarnate, and resurrecting in order to be the messianic figure who would.
Well, this is where prophecy comes in, right? I mean, this is where
using prophecy as their inspiration.
I mean, the Hebrew Scriptures have a ton of prophecy about the one who would come, you know, and of course his name is Jesus. He's the Messiah, who's the one that did not open his mouth. I thought it was interesting that...
are you saying there's a passage in the Old Testament that says the Messiah will be named Jesus? I'm interested in that.
I'm not interested.
Oh, okay.
No, I did not say
I thought that would have been interesting.
that would have been interesting, yes. He's called, of course, the branch. He's called the servant of the Lord. We believe, based on the many references, that the Malach Adonai is a reference to the pre-incarnate Jesus. So, yes, he was a figure who was hanging out in the presence of God or whatever, and then it says the Word became flesh,
right,
and dwelt among us.
That's the Christian innovation on this Jewish angelology.
Well, it's maybe the Christian culmination. Maybe that's the way to put it. But there was already a lot of expectation apart from the quote unquote Christians.
Yeah. That doesn't negate any of the point we've made. So, yeah, sure.
But my point, what I would like to point out, though, is that this idea that Paul is, like you make a reference in, I was watching one of your debates or your presentations, and you're saying that 1 Corinthians 15, the word there for according to, that Paul wasn't, basically, he never really had a real vision of Jesus, but he was getting everything, kind of digging it out of Scripture itself. And the word kata there in the Greek, it can be according to, but it can also be in accordance with. Sure. All right. So, you know, I can say I got something, according to so-and-so, this is what it means, or in accordance with so-and-so. So that nuance there exists in that word, and it doesn't mean that Paul was...
That leaves us uncertain which he meant, right? And the key thing is in 1 Corinthians 15, he just says that. He just says, according to the Scriptures, these things happen. He doesn't mention anyone seeing them. He doesn't mention...
Right, but we can go back to Acts, right? I mean, we have...
Well, that's not back to, that's forward. Now we're talking about, 60 to 100 years later.
Well, I'm talking about the events. And, of course, it wasn't 60 to 100 years later. That's...
Well, actually, the mainstream view now is that Acts was probably written sometime around 110 or 115 AD.
Well,
certainly after 93, because it's actually using Josephus as a source.
That's not true.
No, it isn't.
Go ahead.
Well, you've got a lot of... I guess I don't think I have sound.
Just needs to be closer, yeah.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about, for I've delivered unto you the first, that which I received. Now, when did Paul receive this? Most people think it was about 32, 34 A.D. when he met with the apostles.
Well, he says he got it directly from Jesus in Galatians 1.
Well,
he says he didn't receive it through teaching, he received it through revelation, and only many years later
met with the apostles, and they think it was about 32, 34 B.C., and what they were doing is this was...
Well, it would have been years later that he met the apostles, though, or the other apostles. He himself says it was at least 3 years later.
Yeah. So he says, for I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, and then of the 12. This was the Christian creed. This was going on right after Jesus died.
I know. That's why it's weird that the ministry is not included in it. The idea that Jesus actually walked around and taught the gospel and actually handpicked disciples. This would be like handpicking the disciples would be one of the most crucial parts of the gospel, I would think, especially if they're relying on the tradition coming from the disciples, and yet it's completely missing from 1 Corinthians 15. He just skips right over it as if it didn't matter or didn't exist.
Right, but you know, as an author, you can't footnote everything you say. I mean,
well, but you include extremely vital information like that. I mean,
right, but if that's already common knowledge,
if the gospel is dependent on the witness of the disciples to the life of Jesus, that is literally the most important part of the gospel, and yet it's not in there.
But if this is already common knowledge, if you don't have to go back and explain...
Well, if it was common knowledge, you wouldn't need to repeat the whole thing, right? So was the crucifixion of Jesus. So is that he appeared to Cephas. That's all common knowledge too, and yet he's including that.
Or, I mean, these letters are not to give a full expose of Jesus. They're a letter. Okay,
no, he's reciting the fundamental gospel. He's saying this is the gospel that we believe in. This is this is our most fundamental and important teaching.
He's repeating the basics, the basic creed.
Yeah,
okay.
Jesus preaching to, teaching, and selecting the disciples. That was probably more basic than all the other stuff.
I mean, with people you already know, you have an established history. You don't have to go back and give everything that you've ever talked about.
But that's what he's doing in 1 Corinthians 15. He's going back and repeating the gospel that they preach. Yeah.
That's what he's doing. He's preaching the gospel. He's not talking about selecting the apostles.
Yeah, but I would think that's the most true, especially in the passage where he's talking about why
from the dead. That's the important thing. That is the gospel.
Well, no, the appearances are the most important thing as well. I mean, the other stuff is important too, but he only gets to the idea of Jesus appearing to anyone after his death. There's no ministry in there. There's no handpicking of disciples. There's nothing fundamental like that going on in this passage. That's weird. And at the very least, it's the missing. It's gone. The evidence isn't there. You can't say there was a life of Jesus, there was a ministry, there were disciples being handpicked by him in life, when Paul never mentions any of those things ever happening. And yet he mentions all these other things happening, the crucifixion and the burial and the appearances afterwards.
It's already mentioned in the Gospels. He doesn't need to mention it again.
Well, then he wouldn't need to mention all the other things either.
Right, but if you go on, he's establishing a point so that he can then go on. Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some of you say there is no resurrection from the dead? Right, so he's establishing the point that he's already made.
Yeah.
Right, just like you give a recap of what you said. You don't have to give everything, all the evidence, and all 500 pages of what you said.
One line. Right. He taught that he selected disciples, and then he appeared to the disciples that he selected.
So if he had said that, you would believe it.
Well, yes. If that was in the authentic letters, that would establish historicity for sure. If they said that he was actually teaching a ministry in
so
Galilee,
that one little line should have been in there to establish historicity.
One line would be pretty powerful evidence for the historicity of Jesus.
That would completely change you from an atheist to a believer.
Oh no, that doesn't. I already established that I can accept a historical Jesus. I'm not going to immediately leap to believing that Jesus is God. I did earlier.
But I forgot it.
Like
so you need to repeat that and tell me that again, okay? Because
That's silly.
No, well then what you're saying is silly.
This is ridiculous.
What you're saying is silly. That he has to go back and establish everything. He's going on to make a point about the resurrection. The whole chapter is about the resurrection. So he's given just kind of the very basic. Remember, guys, this is what we talk about. Remember that? Now let me go on from there. Now that I've established where I'm going, let's talk about this resurrection thing.
Yeah, but what he says is not like I'm going to skip parts. He actually says, I'm repeating to you what I taught you. So he's actually summarizing what the gospel is. And we get the same thing in Philippians 2 and various other places where he actually summarizes the gospel. The ministry's not there. There's no handpicked disciples. No one's even referred to as a disciple. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, they're not called disciples.
One thing about the Apostle Paul, how did Paul come to believe in Jesus according to the New Testament? Paul was alive around the time that the historical Jesus should have been living. He helped persecute the Christians. He heard the stories. He held the coats when Stephen was being stoned. What convinced Paul was what we would call an hallucination, what you would call a vision. Paul wasn't convinced by any historical facts, figures, arguments, debates, or any of that stuff. He was knocked off his, excuse my French, ass by this Jesus. And then all of a sudden he decides, oh, maybe Jesus was who he said he was and was real, etc., etc. The only evidence Paul really had for the Jesus of the New Testament was an hallucination. And I don't think that's a valid foundation to base one's life on. Joseph Smith had hallucinations too. Why aren't you Mormon?
Okay. I mean, this is kind of pedantic because, I don't base everything on the Apostle Paul. I accept what Paul said, and the fact that he had a vision. I don't find that crazy. All right, but if he were the only person I were basing what I believe the scriptures are saying, then yeah, maybe there's an issue. But you have all these other evidences. Luke himself, according to Sir Ramsay, was a first-rate historian. So he gives us all kinds of evidence of things that were where they were supposed to be. To suddenly say that it was all just made up and it was all just a bunch of hooey, I don't accept that as being valid.
Sir Ramsay, that's over 100 years old, by the way.
So, I mean, it's still true, right?
Well, the methodology of history was substantially inferior then. Ramsay's been refuted multiple times in the last 100 years on this point.
By who?
Well, the latest scholarship is collected by Richard Purvo in his commentary on Acts for the Hermeneia series. Many other scholars concur with him on this. No, Luke is a terrible historian. Not only, I mean, he's also a dishonest historian. He not only does he get wrong some of the things that he borrows from Josephus, he gets chronology wrong and things like that, but he also completely reverses and alters the story that we get from an eyewitness account in Paul. And Paul writes in Galatians, he was never known to anyone, never seen by anyone in Jerusalem. He wasn't a Jerusalem person. When he converted, he was outside of Judea at the time, and then went to Arabia to preach the gospel, and then for 3 years, and then later came back and eventually went to Jerusalem. Acts has him in Jerusalem from the beginning, does not have him go to Arabia ever, and has him immediately go to the other apostles in Jerusalem. So Luke is completely rewriting history because he's writing the story he wants to be true, but he's completely going against this eyewitness source, Paul himself, telling us what actually happened. So we know Luke is not a reliable historian, and that's just one among many examples of this.
Very much. A round of applause for both sides. Perhaps I should have said, let's get ready to rumble. And now, audience members, you have been great, but it's your chance to ask the questions that you have for our panelists. So we do have a microphone here, and if someone wants to go ahead and line up, no more than 5 in a line at a time, that way we're not just standing around. And make sure your microphone is on there. Okay, as you pose your question, be mindful of the other audience members that are waiting behind you. Be brief. If you have a particular individual who you want to answer the question, call out their name. Again, there's Richard there and Mark, as well as David and Doug, or you can just pose the question and they'll answer. Are we ready? Mr. Timer, this segment will also be 30 minutes. You may begin. Thank you.
Primarily to Richard, but also to Mark. While you may have presented things that had to do with whether or not there was a lack of historicity, I would ask you whether or not that would satisfy the burden of showing that, in fact, he never existed, as opposed to that there was a lack of evidence.
Right. Yeah, that was the point of my bringing up that we have an alternative explanation of the evidence. When we look at other precedents of the sorts of things that have happened with other non-existent people being put into history, and when we look at, for example, Paul's discussions appears to be of a celestial being. We have evidence of a Christian sect who did regard Jesus as only a celestial being. And the idea of him being in history only comes basically a lifetime later, what was then an average lifespan later, in stories that are highly mythicized in their content. So when we look at the particular story arc, the pattern of evidence, it looks like the pattern of evidence we see with people who didn't exist and were basically put into history later. And that's why I think we can conclude that he didn't actually exist, because there isn't the same Jesus in Paul, and it's only many decades later that we get a sort of pretense of a historical Jesus, and there's no other evidence to support the contrary.
And I would like to point out, again, from my little reading that I did, Jesus was the goose that laid golden eggs. It's totally implausible that the Romans, the Jews, and everybody else who knew about Jesus would have just gone ahead and killed him. The fact that Jesus was never put into service by the Romans proves to me beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Jesus of the New Testament never existed. If we had a person today that could walk on water, predict the future, heal people, bring people back from the dead, grant immortality, etc., 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 you'd be darn certain there'd be people that would kidnap him, enslave him, whatever, and force him to do their will. That never took place, therefore that Jesus never existed. The Romans weren't that stupid.
Doug, Dave, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, yeah, we didn't get to have a little rebuttal on what Mark had said. First of all, I don't think the Romans were desperate for anybody. They thought they could handle things just fine. Secondly, I don't think Jesus, as you so pointed out so eloquently, he wouldn't be kidnapped by anybody. He was his own man doing his own thing. He decided to lay his life down when he felt like it. And so I think you need to at least go back and consider part of the story that your scenario is just out there. I mean, it's not going to be true for the Romans because they're going to go conscript some loser Jew, okay? And it's not going to be true for Jesus because if he is who I believe he was, then he wasn't someone to be pushed around. He could do exactly what he wanted to.
Next question.
Yes. How do we know that the Gospels are anonymously written? And I'll direct this to Richard. And how do we know when they were written?
Oh, yes. Well, there's two reasons for that. I mean, first, all of the Gospels are actually titled kata with the name following it. And that in Greek is how you designate source, not author. You would use a different form of Greek to designate author. So when those names were originally attached, someone was actually claiming that those names, whoever they were, we don't even know who they were the sources for the authors, not the authors themselves. And this you can find in mainstream scholarship on this subject. But we also don't know who they are. I mean, it doesn't say who they are, so we don't. It could have been written by those people with those names. We have no idea, but we just still don't know who these people are. So anonymity isn't necessarily the point. The problem is we don't know who they are, and they don't claim to be eyewitnesses either. We know they're not because we know Matthew, for example, copies Mark verbatim. So Matthew can't be an eyewitness because you wouldn't just copy verbatim some other dude who's not an eyewitness. You would actually tell your own eyewitness story. There's many evidences like that. Now, dating. Dating is more complicated. Obviously, the Gospels don't say when they're written, which is unusual for histories. Normally, histories would say when they're written. They often do in the ancient world. But what we do have in the Gospel of Mark are many references to the destruction of the Jewish temple. And many scholars find various places in this. And we know that occurred in 70 AD. So we know Mark is writing after that. Now, scholars actually vary widely into where Mark was written. So there are some scholars who think he was written after 140 AD. That's possible. But the earliest he could have been written would be the 70s AD. Now, there's also... Mark's crucifixion narrative has it's about 20 parallels with another narrative of a different Jesus ben Ananias, who was killed during the war in the 60s AD. A story that's told in Josephus's Jewish War, which was written, we know, because Josephus tells us, in 75. So you could possibly even say that the Gospel of Mark is using that particular passage in Josephus and was writing after 75, for instance. So these are the kinds of things we look for. And then we know then, of course, Matthew and Luke copy Mark, so they had to have been written later. Luke inserts a lot of historical color, a lot of little historical details that we know he's getting from Josephus, particularly because the mistakes he makes in doing that can only be explained by him using Josephus. And using Josephus, another book Josephus wrote, which is the Antiquities, which we know because Josephus tells us was written in 93. So we know Luke was written after 93. And there are some scholars who argue that Luke is even writing after Papias, which would put him much later, 10 to 20, 30 years later even. So, and this is still debated within the field, but that's how you try to date them. You look for evidence that they're written after certain points in time, or that they're using certain sources that you can date, and so on.